to have pretensions to superior sanctity. It also means self-righteous person, a formalist, or a hypocrite. That's a Pharisee. According to whom? Christians. The word sect has become a mere courtesy for most Christians, but strict is this definition's understatement. The more distinct terms in the definition: pretensions to superior sanctity, self-righteous, and hypocrite, as well as formalist, have taken over the meaning of the word Pharisee for most Christians. Inaccuracies about Pharisees punctuate sermons every Sunday in the United States. A recent novelist, Cynthia Beach, painting a picture of a corrupted pastor in her novel, The Surface of Water, channels these inaccuracies when she says of the Pharisees that they were the men of knowledge and the pastor's congregation loves to hate. She explores this dangerous misconception further in one Pastor Goodman, that's her character, with more than a little clarity in the title, in his name. In one Pastor Goodman's sermon conclusion, in which he said, "Though these men know the truth of God, they knew nothing of the love of God. Christ's invitation repels them. Ignoring this invitation to love, they devise a plan to hate. These respected religious leaders scheme to kill the Son of God." Now, if that's not a trope about Jews in the history of the church, I don't know what is. The pastor invites the audience then to choose the side of Jesus or the Pharisees. The ironies, yea, the hypocrisies, of Pastor Goodman's own sins rake the entire novel. The novelist leads us to ask, who's the stereotyped Pharisee now? You may have heard that in Germany there is a coffee drink that you can purchase at posh restaurants in posh sections of Berlin, and that coffee contains plenty of rum. And on the menu you can order this drink under the distinctive name Der Pharisäer, the Pharisee. The semblance of the drink to coffee, but spiced with rum, embodies the myth and stereotype hypocrite, which is no small problem in the history of Germany. Since the Holocaust of World War II and the rise of Jewish scholarship and scholarships in American universities, defining Pharisees in these terms have become anathema, and rightly so. In fact, Pharisee is not a pejorative for our Jewish brothers and sisters. The more one studies Pharisees in the ancient world, the more they refuse to live out the myth's uncomplicated march into evil. Tal Ilan, a famous Israeli scholar, in her essay on the attraction of women to Pharisaism, opens with these words: "Unlike Christianity, which treats the word Pharisee as synonymous with hypocrite, legalist, petty bourgeois, Jews have always understood Pharisaism as the correct and trustworthy side of Judaism." End quote. Those who wince at her claim are the myth-makers in need of correction. But neither Jewish affirmations nor the scholars' anathemas have trickled down to enough church folks. The word Pharisee remains a slur for most of us because Christians have relentlessly maligned the Pharisees and are seemingly unredeemable when it comes to a change about it. A special patience, along with some piercing barbs, are still required if we want to transform Christian instincts. Though at times one hears today that Jesus was himself a Pharisee, a combative one to be sure, identifying Jesus as a Pharisee falls short. What a famed Jewish scholar said about Jesus and the Pharisees matters. Giza Vermesh wrote, "I will state categorically that Jesus represents a kind of charismatic Judaism which substantially differs from the essentially law-seeking, law-studying, and law-abiding Judaism of the Qumran sect and the Pharisees." The tension point between Jesus and the Pharisees does not then reveal an internal dispute between diverse Pharisees. But before we can get to those flashpoints, we need to describe the Pharisees all over again. In thinking about Pharisees, think of the spiritually formed person, think of the ideal and even idealistic person, of ordinary folks whose lives embody holiness and justice and who have the capacities of influencing society. Avoid letting your mind turn to Nathaniel Hawthorne's Dimmesdale in The Scarlet Letter, or Brigitte in Francois Mauriac's A Woman of the Pharisees. Think of Nicodemus. So we need a step-by-step redescription of the Pharisees if we want to preach the parables that mention or suggest Pharisees with integrity, historical accuracy, and social sensitivities. All right? So now a little bit about, as you can see on the overhead. Do you know what I mean by an overhead? Okay. My father was a speech teacher, and he told me one time, and I told him I was using overheads, he said, people who are not interesting and prepared need overheads. I think he'd be impressed by what David Capes did up here in crumpling up a piece of paper and tossing it away. He'd smile, and then he'd say something. The Pharisees make a cameo appearance in only one parable, namely Luke 18's famous parable of the Pharisee and tax collector, which I will now read from the NRSV, and which Tom Long more than cleverly connects to the two guys walk into a bar joke. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And then the parable ends. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. One man was known for this observance, the other stereotype of a man who violated Jewish sensibilities, a saint and a sinner, sort of. Most gospel scholarship perceives the introduction, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves, etc., as Lucan editorial work, and many drop the conclusion in verses 14, I tell you, this man went down home justified, as Lucan redaction as well. For preachers, however, briefly informing your audience on Sunday morning that some of those red words are not actually from Jesus will dull the sermon and maybe tune out the ears of others and risk your opportunity for employment next week. Those words remain stuck in our Bible, and because they are there, we will need to deal with them. It's not an unhappy moment to say that if Luke had not added that opening, most listeners would have. The concluding words, too, would have been a preacher's conclusion anyway. This single reference to Pharisees could be complicated if one were to add others where they are not mentioned but could be read into the text, like the older son of the parable of the prodigal son, or the wheat and the weeds, or the wicked tenants, and others with even less chance of connection. One is enough, and it is enough because it embodies the Christian stereotype so well. Even if it doesn't, it does. That's a put down. While I'm hardly sanguine about the possibility of unraveling the Christian myth and replace it with a more accurate narrative, progress can be made if we get preachers to halt their stereotyping of Pharisees, if we cease labeling others with the term Pharisee, and if we encourage all of us to explain what they were actually like. For pragmatic reasons alone, the snobbish aristocrat Josephus himself became observant of the law of Moses according to the tradition of the Pharisees. He can provide for us a sketch of the major characteristic of a Pharisee in the first century that we can use as the background, if not the foreground, for parable preaching and even more for preaching in general. So I turn now to 7 features of the Pharisees, rooted mostly in Josephus and supplemented from other sources. So, a brief introduction to these 7 features. Jerusalem was run by the Annas family. The high priest at the time of Jesus' last week was Caiaphas, the son-in-law of Annas. The innermost circle around Caiaphas was comprised of the male family members of Annas, other priests, the elders, and Sadducees. The scribes would have functioned a bit like the administrative state in Washington, D.C., though one must exercise caution in analogies to modern levels of government, shifting as they are right now without our even knowing what's going on. That's a put down. Sorry. Power morphs to its situation. The Pharisees morphed according to the morphings of those in power, which means they morphed into the approval of the temple establishment, who had itself morphed into the approval of Rome. At the time, that meant Pilate, and in Rome, Sejanus, and on the island of Capri, Tiberius. The first characteristic of a Pharisee is that they were political. The Pharisees were not priests, and they were not in the ruling political party. Their way of interpreting Torah may have been the dominant culture, but the hands of the powers were in the Annas circle. Not having power did not mean powerlessness. The Pharisees developed the art of negotiation and mediation. They remembered that at one time, for a very brief period, they did have the sway of power in Jerusalem. They were the favorite leading voices in Jerusalem with, at times, Hyrcanus, but then especially under Alexandria Salome. Those were their days. They ended. And I echo the covering of that 1968 song by Irish vocalist Mary Hopkin. Those were the days, my friend, do you remember? That's the song they sang. Study of the history of the Jews from the 3rd century BCE to the end of the 1st century, apart from occasional vocal protests, reveals an absence of power among the Pharisees from the time of the Romans on, especially from the reign of Herod on. A specialist on the Pharisees, E.P. Sanders, said, they simply lost influence. In part, they learned, though not perfectly, when to act and when not. But they continue, he says, to have a hard time being silent about offenses against the law as they saw them. The evidence then, he says, does not indicate withdrawal. This was the view of Jacob Neusner, but rather normal prudence, which conflicted with zeal to obey the law and the desire to control public policy. Rather than being pacifists, during the Herodian and Roman years, however, the Pharisees were as active as they could be without being crushed. But they never lost the desire to broker deals. So they were political. And that's actually a historical position that a generation ago was not held by anybody. They thought they went silent. Second is practice. Jesus would never have described either Judaism or Pharisaism the way many do today. Christians have learned to summarize Pharisaism by using a Christian theology of salvation. The most popular version of Judaism today is called covenantal nomism, an expression formed mostly by E.P. Sanders, and it looks like this. Number 1, God has chosen Israel, and 2, he's given them the law. The law implies both 3, God's promise to maintain election, and 4, the requirement to obey. 5, God rewards obedience and punishes transgression. 6, the law provides for means of atonement, and atonement results in 7, maintenance or reestablishment of the covenantal relationship. 8, All those who are maintained in the covenant by obedience, atonement, and God's mercy belong to the group which will be saved. An important interpretation of the first and the last points is that election and ultimately salvation are considered to be by God's mercy rather than human achievement. That's Sanders. When the aim is final salvation, that is, getting in and staying in, one has shaped the whole of Judaism by Christian soteriology, which is not how Judaism shaped its own set of beliefs. Neither then did the Pharisees, and the conflict of Jesus and the powers of his day was not about the viability of any of these 8 points. Jesus probably agreed with all of them. Instead of this 8-point system of salvation as framed by covenantal nomism, Judaism is better described as a way of life, an observance rooted in 4 elements. Again, Sanders made these points. The vast majority of Jews in the ancient world had these 4 characteristics. 1, they believed in and worshiped the God of Israel. 2, they accepted the Hebrew Bible, often in translation, as revealing God's will. 3, consequently, they observed most aspects of the Mosaic law. And 4, they identified themselves with the history and the fate of the Jewish people. Of course, there were varieties of observance of these 4 elements, and different locations gave particular emphases, say Judea versus Galilee versus Damascus versus Rome. But this 4-fold breakdown was boilerplate for Jews. To be a Jew was to live like a Jew, which meant all 4 of these features. Judaism, we Christians need to be reminded, was not a systematic theology, but a way of life, a practice, an observance, or a purity. What made a Pharisee was to observe a way of life according to their interpretation of the Torah. The Hebrew word for this way of life was halakha, or walk. The Torah, truth be told, was in need of interpretation. As Israeli scholar Yohanatan Adler has put in with clarity, the legal material in the Pentateuch is written in language so opaque and oftentimes so self-contradictory that it could hardly have been implementable in real life without its readers deploying considerable interpretive efforts. I could read that again, but I won't. Whether he has overcooked the tensions of the legal material in the Pentateuch or not, his result obtains with undeniable accuracy. The Jews before, during, and after Jesus' day were hard at work interpreting for the sake of implementing. Jesus and the Pharisees came into conflict over halakha, theirs versus his. They had issues with Jesus over hand washing before meals, fasting observances, Sabbath practices, adultery and divorce. How easy were these matters? Oaths, retaliation and justice, almsgiving, the location of praying in public, and love for one's enemies. Both were dead set in their commitment to Torah. Both believed the Torah was God's will for the whole of Israel, and both could and defend themselves in the presence of the other. One is tempted in the spirit of toleration to say this is all in good fun, but such disputes concerned real observances, and observance mattered because it was the testimony to faithfulness. A Finnish scholar named Thomas Holmein calls these covenant path markers. How you behave in each one of these will determine which group you're in. So the second is about practice. The third characteristic of a Pharisee is precise. From their political power or lack of it, and their beliefs or lack of emphasis of them, we turn to the most important feature of the Pharisees. They were text brokers, that is, they knew the Torah, they were observant of the Torah as they interpreted it, and they were able to mediate their interpretations to others. Nearly every time the Pharisees appear in the New Testament, in Josephus, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then later in the rabbinic texts, The backstory is about their commitment to the Torah. The front story shakes down into the specifics of their interpretation of the Torah. In his own explanatory gloss on a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, Mark says, "For the observant, or Pharisees, and all the Judeans, if they don't wash their hands cupped, they don't eat, grabbing onto the convention of the elders." That's my translation. Josephus says the Pharisees are those who are esteemed most skillful in the exact explication of their laws. Though they were not as strict in either interpretation or observance as the Essenes, the Pharisees were known for precision in interpretation. Comparing Sadducees with the Pharisees, Josephus writes, "The Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the law of Moses, and for that reason it is that the Sadducees reject them and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory, which are in the written word, but not to observe what are derived from the tradition of our forefathers." Precision and seriousness differ from strictness and severity. The Pharisees were not Mark Twain's Presbyterians. When the Apostle Paul describes himself as a Pharisee, he says that I have belonged to the strictest set of our religion and lived as a Pharisee. In fact, the Pharisees were not as strict as the Essenes, but Paul was proud of his Phariseeism, just as Baptists are proud of their Baptist connections. Their observance was both noticeable and influential with those outside their own immediate circles. Experience knows precise interpretations arise to the level of the Bible itself, whether that's with the Pharisees, the Essenes, or modern Christian denominations. But the Pharisees were not what is often called biblicists today. And the next item in how Jesus would have experienced the Pharisees counters nearly everything said about Pharisees on Sunday's pulpits. The fourth characteristic is the Pharisees were first century progressives, liberals. Now just wait a minute before that sinks in. Laws in the pages of the Hebrew Bible evolve. I'm not going to start preaching like David Capes, so I'll stay closer to the microphone. Expansion, adjustment, accommodation. These are the tunes played already in the Torah itself. Jesus and his contemporaries perceived the Pharisees to use our terms as comparatively progressive or liberal in their interpretations of the Torah. Take the Essenes, or at least the authors of some of the texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You have to be nuanced when scholars are present, because not everybody thinks they were written by the Essenes. Relying on perhaps the prophet Daniel, where one discovers the expression, "He will flatter with smooth words." The scrolls describe some influential group in Jerusalem as seekers of smooth things. That is, they were breaching the covenant, quotation, for they had sought flattery, choosing travesties of true religion. They looked for gaps in the law, like lawyers. They favored the fine neck. They called the guilty innocent and the innocent guilty. They overstepped covenant, violated law, and they conspired together to kill the innocent. For all those who lived pure lives, they loathed from the bottom of their hearts. So they persecuted them violently and were happy to see the people quarrel. That's a quotation. That's polemics in the first century. The writer of the songs at Qumran speaks of being liberated from the congregation of the seekers of flattering things. The seekers of smooth things were Pharisees. Smoothness has the sense of broadening, expanding, and clarifying the Torah so that ordinary people can practice it in ordinary life. Smoothness, then, has to do with interpretation, to adjusting, accommodating, updating. Pharisees are perceived by the scrolls as activist judges, as progressives, as lenient, as liberals. The Pharisees were observant and precise, but their precise interpretations led toward practicable solutions. Another expert, Yair Forstenberg, on the Pharisees says the Pharisees promoted a human form of law emanating from the people's ancestral customs, acknowledging their human state and weakness and allowing them as such to participate in the ritual activity in the temple and beyond because, he says, they had a policy of compromise. Compromise is not a word many today would connect to the word Pharisees. The scrolls label the Pharisees with strong terms, the kinds of terms we find as well in the Gospels. An unnamed leader of the Pharisees was called scoffer, liar, preacher of lies. Accusations continue with forming a fence around the law. As builders of the wall, they engage in niece marriages, which is probably an exaggeration. That's how you win rhetorical arguments. The oral law, or Bet Talmud, is connected to them. They misdirect many or are guilty of false teaching. Yet the very group accusing the Pharisees of expanding to make the Torah smoother for observance, the Essenes of Qumran, had their own expansions. Moses prohibits eating the blood of birds and animals. The scrolls expand the draining of blood also to fish. Jesus does not use these terms for the Pharisees, but one long chapter in Matthew's gospel, according to too many, breathes out similar hot takes. One man's strict deduction from law is another man's expansion. Their progressive interpretations made the Pharisees popular with ordinary Jews outside the circles of power in Jerusalem. Those circles of power, as Martin Goodman has argued throughout his career, were decidedly unpopular with the populace. So fifth characteristic is they were popular. Jesus had to face the popularity and widespread respect of Pharisees, especially among women, as can be seen in this observation and an important study of women. It is plausible, given the number of cases of women supporting Pharisees and vice versa, that ancient elite women may indeed have been among the group's strongest supporters, financial and otherwise, and that Pharisees in turn provided counsel to women rulers, end quote. The Pharisees' capacity to persuade and even calm down the crowds was well known to the ruling classes of Jerusalem. Notice these lines from Josephus, and these lines represent stuff he records from the 2nd century BCE into the 1st century CE. Here's one quote. However, this prosperous state of affairs moved the Jews to envy Hyrcanus, but they that were the worst disposed to him were the Pharisees, who are one of the sects of Jews, as we have informed you already. These have so great a power over the multitude that when they say anything against the king or against the high priest, they are immediately believed. In another text, he says the Pharisees are extremely influential among the townsfolk. And then in another text, he says that because the multitude would not otherwise bear them in people who disagreed with the Pharisees. To repeat, the influence of the Pharisees in observance was so strong it shaped Josephus. Josephus writes in his Vita, being now in my 19th year, I began to involve myself in public life. This is the critical point. Deferring to the philosophical school of the Pharisees, which is rather like one called Stoic among the Greeks. So when Josephus went public as a public politician, he had to learn to observe the Torah like a Pharisee. The Pharisees were the people's choice. A recent Israeli scholar, Israel Knoll, has concluded that the multitudes came to rely on the Pharisees in large part because Pharisaic rituals and prayers expressed the anticipation that God would save and bless the people in their times of need and distress. Christians have claimed ad nauseum that the Pharisees oppressed the people with their demanding laws, their legalistic adherence to their traditions, and their ever snoopy watchfulness lest some Jew break out into laughter. Their popularity disproves every element of this inaccurate, slurring set of stereotypes. Pharisees were popular because they were likable and because they took into consideration human nature when they developed their interpretations of Torah. Their gruff, stern appearance in movies contradicts their charm and affability that went hand in hand with their popularity. Popular people are not mean. Andy Stanley's a nice guy. And that's what the Pharisees were. And I'm not saying Andy Stanley was a Pharisee. Although I would if you would give me my definition. One of their contemporaries writes that they were mutually affectionate. Imagine that. Pharisees liked one another and cultivated concord in relation to the community. I've run out of terms that begin with P, so I leave it to the Baptist preachers given to alliteration to find a P for my sixth and seventh points. Six, they were self-consciously faithful. What can be said about the Pharisees can be said about other groups in the mix with Jesus. Namely, they saw themselves representing the truest way of life. That others, say Essenes or Sadducees, could say the same of themselves does not diminish the Pharisees' claim. In that they perceived that they represented the true way of life, the Pharisees compared themselves with others and no doubt sat in judgment on all ways of life deemed inferior to theirs. Comparing one's morals to others is a human tendency. Some Pharisees went into polemical and apologetical and delegitimation mode about the kingdom coalition of Jesus. As one scholar put it, when a large group is faced with a dissident small group, a sect or heresy in the religious sphere, it attacks the other group by a process called annihilation and rejects it by assigning it a lower ontological status. So tension with Jesus then was inevitable. He struck back with his own forms of status-lowering labels. So I turn now to a final characteristic of the Pharisees, one mostly unstated but implicit in everything that has so far been observed. The Pharisees were agents to the people. This is where I'd put the crowds in the Gospels. Jesus knew the Pharisees were dependent upon the powers around the family of Annas, along with the priests and elders of Jerusalem. To swipe words from Hamilton, they were not in the room when it happened. They were retainers of those who were in the room, the elite establishment. They sustained the system, supporting both those above them and below them. I prefer the term agents or mediators for their social function and location. Bruno Latour, the French sociologist of actor network theory, would say they were only intermediaries rather than mediators, but that's a sociologist's distinction. Those popular with people developed the art of negotiation and mediation with the establishment. The Pharisees inevitably fell into being agents, even servants, of the circles around Caiaphas. Steve Mason, an expert on the Pharisees, calls the Pharisees brokers of power between the aristocracy and the masses. The Pharisees did not show up in Galilee on their own authority. The passionate Pharisee Saul, remember this, needed letters from Caiaphas to accomplish his designs for those earliest churches and believers in Damascus. We can be forgiven for wondering if there was a Pharisee lurking wherever Jesus was active. Forgiven, but mistaken. Grace can be extended because there are so many instances in the Gospels of Pharisees inspecting Jesus, as in when the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, as if they're snooping through the window, or that they queried Jesus when his followers were plucking grains on a Sabbath. The gospel writers have made their followers, their observing of Jesus, boilerplate. What is not noticed often enough, however, is that the Pharisees are not residents of Galilee so much as they have been sent from the temple authorities in Jerusalem to Galilee. A number of stories describe them as emissaries. In a story about a healing by Jesus, we are told Pharisees and teachers of the law who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem were sitting nearby. Excuse the hyperbole and notice from Jerusalem. Every village is the hyperbole. Jews outside of the priesthood developed a sense of purity before eating. To fulfill their duty, they performed a ritual hand washing. Jesus got into a dispute with Pharisees and scribes over his disciples eating with unwashed hands. The dispute does not matter for the moment. Paul Sloan will clear that up. What does matter is that the Pharisees and scribes who were disputing with Jesus had come from Jerusalem. Another passage records that the Pharisees exited or came out, and what that means might be clearer when Matthew mentions these Pharisees were accompanied by Jerusalem-based Sadducees. The associates of the Pharisees also suggest Pharisees were emissaries. At times, they needed support in Galilee. When pressing Jesus or his followers about some topic, at times, the Pharisees needed institutional backup from the authorities. So we see them accompanied by scribes, lawyers, and Herodians. Okay, I'm going to run out of time. Am I about running out of time? I grew up Baptist, Lynn. Okay. All right. I'll skip Matthew 23 for now. All right, and here's some things that I think we should do as preachers. Never use Pharisee as a slur for anyone or anything. Avoid slurs, stereotypes, and rhetorical labels for others. The tone and how we use such terms matters. Pharisee. That's a lot different than saying Pharisee. There are charitable tones for using terms like fundamentalist, evangelical, progressive, liberal, and mainline, as well as Republican and Democrat. Never define Pharisees with the word hypocrisy. Instead, use Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist or Churches of Christ to see where that slur takes you. Because the first thing they'll do is they'll raise their hand and say, but I know people who aren't like that. And that's exactly how first century Pharisees responded to the language of Jesus. Quickly, we realize it was a stereotype in the Gospels. Furthermore, define Pharisees as those who were observant of the Torah as they interpreted, like Anglican or Lutheran, for their interpretation of Christianity. Then recognize that the Pharisees were popular and begin to connect them to popular teachers in our day, like Adam Hamilton or N.T. Wright and Frederick Buechner and Annie Dillard and Rachel Held Evans and Beth Moore. If you suddenly think that's not kind or fair, I've accomplished what I sought to accomplish today. The Pharisees were more like those folks than William Wolfe, John MacArthur, Mark Driscoll, or Megan Basham. Recognize the vicious downhill slide from Pharisee to Jew, to all Jews of all time, to Martin Luther, and to the Holocaust. Always explain what a Pharisee was before turning to the gospel rhetoric about the Pharisees. And I conclude with this. Of course, there was tension between Jesus and the Pharisees, along with their friends, the scribes, Herodians, and elders, but not for the reasons we have been giving for centuries. Their differences were over how best to observe the Torah, over who did it best, and who Jesus was. But that's for another day. All right. Thank you.